I went to a party at my friend Jared's place last year, around Halloween. It was one of those places surrounded by fields instead of neighbors, and the gravel driveway felt about a mile long. The house itself was old but decent, with the porch lights wrapped in orange string bulbs. There was also a speaker propped in a window, blasting music loud enough to carry halfway down the road. Inside, the air smelled like beer and sweat, and the kitchen counter was stacked with half-empty bottles, candy wrappers, and a few red cups. I'd gone with two of my friends, Terry and Megan. We all told our parents we were staying at Jared's place for the night, which wasn't a total lie. We were just planning to stay a few hours, then walk home, since it wasn't that far. That way, I wouldn't have to worry about my parents waiting up and possibly seeing me drunk. The only problem was that the route back was mostly dark two-lane roads with no sidewalks, and by the time we were ready to leave, it was close to midnight. Megan ended up catching a ride with someone else, and Terry decided to crash there because he was too buzzed to walk, but I didn't want to stay. When I mentioned heading out, Jared told me the fastest way back was to cut through the cornfield behind his property. He said it came out about a quarter mile from the main road. I'd never walked through it before, but I figured it couldn't be that bad. It was cold enough that the bugs were gone, and I had my phone flashlight if it got too dark. The field stretched out behind the house like a black wall. The corn was still standing tall even though harvest season had started, and the rows looked tight and narrow. I hesitated for a second at the edge, then switched on my flashlight and stepped in. The ground was uneven and soft in places, and the stalks rustled every time I brushed past them. It was darker than I expected, and after a few minutes, the house lights disappeared behind me. I could still hear faint music at first, but it faded fast. The only sounds left were my shoes crunching on the dirt and the occasional creak of dry leaves rubbing together. I tried to keep my path straight, counting steps between rows so I wouldn't veer off too far. Every few seconds, I'd lift my phone to make sure I was still going in the right direction. That was when I first noticed the sound of footsteps other than mine. They weren't close, and they were just faint enough to notice. When I stopped, they stopped. I didn't panic at first, because it was probably an echo, or maybe an animal moving through the stalks. I listened for a while longer, then started walking again. The sound started again too. I turned in a slow circle, and shined my phone in every direction, but all I saw were stalks swaying slightly from the light breeze. My flashlight wasn't very strong, and the beam only reached a few rows ahead. The corn looked thicker that way, almost like the field stretched on forever. I called out once, just to see if someone would answer, but no one did. The sound came again, and it was definitely footsteps, heavy ones. The stalks crackled and snapped somewhere off to my right, so I stayed still, waiting, and they stopped again. My hand felt slick against my phone, and I realized I'd been gripping it too tightly. I thought about turning around, but I wasn't sure which direction the house was anymore. The rows all looked the same, and I didn't want to circle back toward whoever was out there. I decided to keep going forward, because if Jared was right, then I'd hit the road soon enough. I moved faster, brushing the stalks aside with one arm while holding my phone in the other. Then the noise started again, but it was harder to tell where it came from. It sounded like it was moving parallel to me, just out of sight. I tried shining the light in that direction again, but all it did was reflect off the pale husks. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a quick shift of something dark about 20 feet away. I froze and listened, but it was silent again. I started walking even faster, almost jogging now, and the sound followed. I could hear the stalks snapping under someone's weight as they moved beside me. Then I started running, and I didn't care if I tripped or got turned around. I just wanted out of there. My shoulder slammed against a stalk, and dry leaves scraped my face, but I kept moving. I glanced over once and caught a glimpse of someone moving between the rows. Finally, I saw a break ahead. The field started to thin, and a faint light came from the road beyond it. I pushed through the last few rows and stumbled into the open, gasping for air. I turned back toward the field just as another figure stepped out a few rows down. It was a grown man, maybe in his 40s. He was holding something in his hand, and even from where I stood, I could hear it clink as he shifted his grip. That was when I realized that it was a gun, probably a shotgun or a rifle. He didn't run toward me, but he didn't back away either. He just stood there, half hidden by the stalks. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I sprinted towards the nearest porch light I could see, which was about 2 houses down. It was an older couple's house, and I'd seen them out in their yard before. Even though I knew they'd probably be in bed, I started pounding on the door, shouting for help. That was when I heard a gunshot from behind me, and I knew it came from the guy who was following me. Just then, the porch light flicked on, and a man approached the door from the other side. "What happened?" he asked. "There's someone out there," I said. "In the cornfield. He was following me." The man called the police, but he was too scared to let me in, which is actually understandable. I ran around to the back of the house and hid behind a tree, but I wasn't sure if the man with the gun was coming or not. The police showed up about 10 minutes later, and only then did I start to feel safe. They didn't find the man, but they found plenty of signs someone had been there. Fresh footprints that didn't match mine, and 2 cigarette butts near the center of the field. The officer said it was strange, because the prints didn't go back toward the house or the road. They just stopped partway through the field like whoever made them had turned around and gone deeper in. They told me it was probably a trespasser, maybe someone who'd been sleeping out there or watching the house, but I wasn't sure what to think. When I got home, nobody was awake, and I just went to bed, where I laid awake for a few hours before getting up. After that, I never cut through a cornfield again. Even during the day, I couldn't look at it without remembering that night. When I was in my first year at college, I used to go for a run every morning before my first class. It helped me wake up and clear my head before a long day at school. The trail I usually took was about 3 miles long and cut through a wooded area behind the university. It was popular with runners and dog walkers during the day, but early in the morning, it was pretty much always empty. I liked that time of day because I didn't have to deal with anyone. That morning was foggier than usual. I almost didn't go because I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead, but I'd been skipping too many workouts lately, so I decided to stick to my routine. I wore my usual running gear, black leggings, a gray hoodie, and my old sneakers. When I started jogging, the fog swallowed most of the trees, and the woods looked different than usual. A few minutes in, I passed the wooden bridge that crossed a shallow stream. Normally, you could see the reflection of the trees in the water, but that morning, it just looked like a dull gray soup. I slowed down when I reached a fork in the trail. The left side looped back towards the parking lot, and the right side went deeper into the woods. I usually went right because it added another mile. I figured it was fine since I knew the trail well. The farther I went, the thicker the fog became. I couldn't even see the tops of the trees anymore, just their trunks fading into white. I pulled my hood up, trying to stay warm, and kept running. The path was covered in damp leaves, and I had to watch my footing to avoid slipping. After a while, I noticed that there were footprints beside mine that hadn't been there before. At first I thought they were my own from a previous lap, but they couldn't be. The mud was darker, and the prints looked larger, like from a man's boots. I slowed down and turned my head, but the fog made it impossible to see very far. Everything was quiet except for a few birds somewhere in the distance. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe someone else had come through earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me. I decided to turn around and head back to the parking lot anyway. When I did, I saw a dark figure standing in the middle of the trail. He was maybe 30 feet away, and he seemed to be holding a large stick. He was just standing there, blocking the path. I froze for a moment, trying to figure out if he was just another jogger. But the stick he held didn't look like a walking stick. It looked like a thick branch, the kind you'd use as a weapon. I didn't want to panic, so I called out, "Hey, you okay?" My voice sounded muffled in the fog, and the man didn't answer. He took a slow step forward, then another. I took a step back, gripping my phone in my pocket. I didn't want to panic and run, because at the time, I was scared that he'd chase me. I turned slowly and started jogging the other way, trying to seem casual. My pace picked up fast once I created a bit of distance. I could hear the sound of my shoes hitting the trail, and the faint thud of his steps behind me, but the fog made it impossible to tell how close he was. I tried to stay on the main path, but the woods all looked the same. I passed the small bridge again, and just kept going. I spotted a bend in the trail ahead, and pushed harder. My legs started to burn, and I could hear leaves rustling behind me. I looked back once, and saw his outline moving through the fog. He was running now. My foot caught a root sticking out of the ground, and I stumbled, but didn't fall. I knew the trail curved near an old wooden signpost up ahead. If I could get around that and out of sight, maybe I could trick him. I sprinted toward it, grabbed a low branch from the ground, and dragged it behind me so it would fall across the trail. I hoped that it might cover my footprints, but I don't know how much it helped. Then I slipped off to the side and crouched behind a thick tree trunk. The sound of footsteps grew louder. I held my breath and watched as the man's shape appeared through the fog. I was hidden pretty well among the brush, but I could see the trail well. As soon as the man came into my sight, he tripped hard, falling forward onto the dirt. As soon as he was down, I bolted back toward the main path, ignoring the sting in my knees. When I reached the clearing near the parking lot, I could finally see again. My car was still there, and it was the only car in the lot. I ran straight to it, got inside, and locked the doors. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the trail entrance was empty. I drove off without checking again. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know if he'd gotten up and left, or if he was still out there waiting for someone else. I reported it to campus security, but they said they couldn't do much without a clear description. They offered to have patrols drive by the trail in the mornings, which I appreciated. A few weeks later, I started hearing stories from other students who ran the same trail. Someone had spotted a man camping in the woods. He apparently had a tarp, a small fire pit, and a pile of broken branches stacked like weapons. No one had actually spoken to him, but a few people said he watched from a distance whenever joggers passed by. Campus security closed off the trail for a few days, while the local police searched the area. They found signs of a campsite and some old food wrappers, but the man was gone. After that, the school warned students not to run alone, especially early in the morning. I started going to the gym instead. It wasn't the same, but at least it felt safe. Sometimes when I drove past the woods, I thought about that morning, and I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't noticed him in time. A month later, I was studying in the library when I overheard two guys talking near the vending machines. They were saying a man had been caught farther down the same trail system, closer to the highway. Apparently he'd been trying to approach lone runners, mostly women. The police later confirmed he'd been living out there for months, moving from one campsite to another. They said he'd been carrying a large branch sharpened on one end. It turned out he'd already scared several people before me, but no one had gotten a clear look until recently. Hearing that made everything feel real again. For weeks, I convinced myself I'd overreacted, and that maybe he was just a weird guy passing through. But knowing he'd been targeting runners made me realize how close I'd come to something much worse. When I was 11, Halloween was my favorite holiday, and everyone in my neighborhood went all out. There were pumpkins on pretty much every porch, and tons of kids trick-or-treating. I think a lot of people from other neighborhoods even drove in just for the occasion. That year, our group included me, my best friend Dylan, his little sister Emma, and two other kids from our block. We started at around 6, right after sunset. The air was cool, and leaves stuck to our shoes as we cut across the yards between houses. Everyone was laughing and yelling to compare what they'd gotten so far. Dylan was wearing a cheap zombie mask, and I was dressed as a baseball player. Emma had a princess costume that was already ripped from brushing against bushes. The other two were Brad and Marcus, and they were both some kind of superheroes, but they ditched their masks halfway through. Eventually, we made it pretty far from the houses that we knew well. It was a bit unfamiliar, but still probably only a 20-minute walk from my house. That was when we noticed one house that didn't fit in. Every other place had lights on and decorations out, but this one was completely dark. The curtains were drawn, and the yard looked overgrown. There wasn't even a pumpkin by the door. Dylan said it used to belong to an older man who never came outside, and that his lawn hadn't been mowed all summer. Emma said we should skip it, but Brad said we should knock. We all stood at the edge of the walkway, arguing about who would do it. Marcus said he'd go if Dylan did, but Dylan told him to stop being stupid. The rest of the street was full of kids, but somehow that one house felt cut off from everything else. The longer we stood there, the quieter it seemed. Finally, Brad said, "Fine, I'll do it." He jogged up the walkway and knocked 3 times, and nothing happened, and I almost felt relieved. But then the porch light flicked on, the door opened, and a man stood there wearing a sweater and sweatpants, no costume. He looked normal, but there was something creepy about him. He said,
"You kids looking for candy? I've got something special inside."
Brad laughed nervously, and I told him we should go, but the man stepped back and motioned him in.
"Just come in for a second,"
he said.
"You'll like it."
Brad hesitated, but then he shrugged and walked inside. The man smiled again and shut the door. Then Emma whispered, "What's he doing?" Dylan ran up and pounded on the door, yelling Brad's name, but no one answered. That's when I felt the first real wave of fear. We turned and ran towards our neighborhood, yelling for help. We ran 3 blocks before we found anyone we trusted. Dylan's uncle lived a few streets over, so we burst into his yard yelling about what happened. He came out in his undersized Superman costume holding a beer, and he was trying to calm us down. Once we got the story out, he looked towards the house and said, "Stay here." He grabbed his flashlight and walked fast in that direction. It felt like forever before he came back. He said the house was dark and no one answered the door when he knocked. He called the police from his phone, and we all stood there while Emma started crying. I remember how quiet the street felt, even with the sound of kids laughing somewhere far away. It was still Halloween, but it didn't feel like it anymore. When the police arrived, they checked the front door first, then the sides of the house. Everything was locked. They went around to the back, and one of them tried the basement windows. After a few minutes, one of them radioed for permission to force entry. We waited near the sidewalk while neighbors started coming out to see what was going on. When they finally got inside, the lights flicked on through the windows for the first time that night. The officers moved from room to room, and then one of them yelled for another to come down to the basement. They were down there for a long time, but then one came back up and talked quietly with the others. An officer came over to ask us some more questions. He wanted to know exactly what happened and how long Brad had been inside. Dylan tried to explain everything, but his voice was shaking, and he wasn't making that much sense. The officer said they hadn't found the man or Brad yet, but there were clues in the basement. Our parents came to get us, and they told us to go home and stay put. The police said they'd contact us if they found anything. That night, I barely slept. Every time a car passed outside, I thought it might be someone coming to say they'd found Brad. I kept replaying the moment when the man opened the door, wondering why I didn't yell louder or grab Brad's arm. By morning, news vans were parked up and down the street, so the story spread fast. Reporters said police were still looking for both the man and the missing boy. It felt strange to see it on the news, knowing it was our group they were talking about. Brad was found the next afternoon at a gas station, nearly 20 miles away. A driver had spotted him sitting on the curb near the air pump, barefoot and holding a half-empty candy bag. He didn't say much at first, but later told the police the man had driven him out there in a van and left him after filling up with gas. He didn't know where they'd gone after leaving the house, and he couldn't remember what roads they took. When the police went back to the house, the man was gone, and there was no sign of a van. They ran the deed on the house, but apparently, the place was supposed to be vacant. Whoever that man was, he wasn't supposed to be living there. Brad came home, but he looked pale and wouldn't talk about what happened. His parents pulled him out of school for a while, and eventually they moved to another town. We only saw him once more before they left. He came over to Dylan's house and sat with us in the backyard, but he didn't say much. After that, no one went near that house again. The police boarded it up for a few months, and eventually a new family moved in. They repainted it and fixed the yard, but I never liked walking by. Even years later, when I was old enough to drive, I'd take the long way around instead of passing it.